Okay, in Dr. Craig's universe, no matter how good these people are, they are doomed. If you are praying to the monkey god Hanuman, you are doomed. Okay. You will be tortured in hell for eternity. Now, is there the slightest evidence for this? No. It just says so in Mark 9 and Matthew 13 and Revelation 14. Okay, perhaps you'll remember from the Lord of the Rings, it says when the elves die, they go to Valinor, but they can be reborn in Middle-earth. I say that just as a point of comparison.
He's comparing Lord of the Rings to the Bible and its claims.
Okay, well here we're being offered, I'm glad he raised the issue of psychopathy, we're being offered a psychopathic and psychotic moral attitude. It's psychotic because this is completely delusional. There's no reason to believe that we live in a universe ruled by an invisible monster, Yahweh.
The God Debate 2. Harris versus Craig. That is Sam Harris versus William Lane Craig. Look, ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to Christian apologists who debate, William Lane Craig is the slickest, the sleekest, the car salesman, it don't matter if he's outside of his element. He debated botanist on plants. He doesn't care, which is a big red flag for me, but also catching him with a lot of statements he says in the past where he takes things out of quotes or takes it out of context, the quotes. I really appreciate you all for being here. Sincerely part of the community. Make sure you subscribe, check that bell, like the video, share it out there, but check it out. We're about to give them the juicy stuff. They did their opening in part 1. If you missed it, go check it out. Sam Harris, 20-minute opening. William Lane Craig, 20-minute opening. Now we're getting to rebuttals, and let's see how this goes, because one has to have absolute ethics, morality in God, or there is none. Let's see.
Professor Craig now has 12 minutes for rebuttal. Timekeeper, are you ready? Begin.
You'll recall in my first speech that I said I was going to defend two basic contentions tonight. First, that if God exists, then we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. First, I explained that if God exists, then objective moral values are grounded in the character of God himself, who is essentially compassionate, fair, kind, generous, and so forth.
I wonder if you grant him that a God exists, how could you prove that it actually does ground in that God? How could you prove it?
Here, Dr. Harris didn't have anything by way of disagreement.
You'd have to assume it. It would just be pure assumptions. There'd be no way of knowing for sure. You just make a case and make you, hey, believe in this theology that I'm telling you.
To say, but I do want to clear up a possible confusion. He represented this by saying that if religion were not true, then words like good and evil, right and wrong would have no meaning. I'm not maintaining that. That is to confuse moral ontology with moral semantics. Moral ontology asks, what is the foundation of objective moral values and duties? Moral semantics asks, what is the meaning of moral terms? And I am not making any kind of semantical claim tonight that good means something like commanded by God. Rather, my concern is moral ontology. What is the ground or the foundation of moral values and duties? To give an illustration, think of light. Light is a certain visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum, but obviously that isn't the meaning of the word light. People knew how to use the word light long before they discovered its physical nature. And I might also add, they certainly knew the difference between light and darkness long before they understood the physics of light. Now, in exactly the same way, we can know the meaning of moral terms like good and evil, right and wrong, and know the difference between good and evil without being aware that the good is grounded in God ontologically.
I just don't get why that extra step is needed. Help me, someone who studies ethics, who knows this philosophy better than me in the comments, please help me understand why it would be necessary to have a God beyond the means of us understanding good and evil and whatnot, whether or not it's absolute or it's the standard version of what humans have achieved over time and observed over time to come to conclude is most right and what's most wrong. I don't understand.
So that is the position I'm defending tonight, is that moral values are grounded ontologically in God. Second, our moral duties are grounded by God's commandments, which are necessary reflections of his nature. Here, the only response I detected from Dr. Harris was to refer to the atrocities in the Hebrew Bible. But I think this is quite irrelevant to tonight's discussion.
No, you keep bringing in God's commandments. God commands atrocities in the Old Testament. What are you talking about?
Plenty of divine command theorists who are not Jews or Christians and place no stock whatsoever in the Bible. So this isn't an objection to divine command theory that I'm defending tonight. Now, if you are interested in biblical ethics, I want to highly recommend Paul Copan's new book.
God, this is the same old shtick. This always gets brought up by Christian apologists. They always bring this up.
Is God a moral monster? Which examines those passages in the Hebrew Bible in light of the ancient Near East, and I can guarantee you it will be a very enlightening and interesting read. But this issue is strictly irrelevant in tonight's debate. So we've not heard any objection.
It's irrelevant in this debate, but you bring it up.
To a theistic grounding for ethics. If God does exist, it's clear, I think.
He came with the book prepared to show the book. It's like he knew this was going to get brought up, so he wanted to plug his apologetics friend.
Obvious even that we have a sound foundation for objective moral values and duties. Now, what if God does not exist? Is there a sound foundation, first of all, for objective moral values? Now here, Dr. Harris said you don't need religion in order to have universal morality. Again, that's a confusion. Of course you don't. Remember, the Nazis, for example, could have won World War II and established a universal morality. The issue isn't universality. The issue is objectivity. And I'm maintaining that in the absence of God, there isn't any reason, any explanation for the existence of objective moral values. Now, Dr. Harris says, but we can imagine creatures being in the worst possible misery, and it's obviously better for creatures to be flourishing. The well-being of conscious creatures is good. Well, of course it is. That's not the question. We agree that all things being equal, flourishing of conscious creatures is good. The question is rather, if atheism were true, what would make the flourishing of conscious creatures objectively good?
It's kind of interesting how he says he agrees with Sam about the best and most flourishing for conscious creatures, but in his debate with Kagan, the philosopher, expert, Kelly Kagan, I never look back to see his name. It might be worth me doing that now. I did a actual video. If you haven't seen it, you really should. He debated a legit philosopher, and it ended pretty badly for William Lane Craig. And that is, William Lane Craig got schooled by atheist Shelley Kagan. Shelley takes him to the woodshed and spanks him. Now, here's the problem. He says he agrees with conscious creatures flourishing. Kagan put his feet to the fire on animals suffering and animals. Craig does not agree with this. Craig probably goes to the Bible, finds ways where animals are sacrificial or could be eaten, clean and unclean animals, and justifies those things. Now, I'm not trying to be hypocritical because I eat meat too, but don't act like you are all about that, and yet your whole worldview, you're living this way where you're not really saying all conscious creatures should flourish.
Conscious creatures might like to flourish, but there's no reason on atheism to think that it would really be objectively good.
I know there's many theists, but I know a lot of people who aren't theists that literally go that extra step and actually say, you know what, I'm not going to be a hypocrite, and they become vegan. I don't know a lot of theists, especially Christians, who have turned vegan. I just don't know a lot of them. I can name a few, but usually they're not in like an orthodox crowd, which is interesting to note.
Now here, Dr. Harris, I think, is guilty of misusing terms like good and bad, right and wrong, in equivocal ways. He will often use them in non-moral senses. For example, he'll say there are objectively good and bad moves in chess. Now, that's clearly not a moral use of the terms good and bad. You just mean they're not apt to win or produce a winning strategy. It's not evil what you've done. And similarly, in ordinary English, we use the words good and bad in a number of non-moral ways. For example, we say Notre Dame has a good team. Now, we can hope it's an ethical team, but that's not what's indicated by the win-loss record. That is a different meaning of good. Or we say that's a good way to get yourself killed. Or that's a good game plan. Or the sunshine felt good. Or that's a good route to East Lansing.
But why wouldn't those terms be relatable to something that is, in a sense, somewhat ethical? If you're saying that this is the best route, why wouldn't that be a good route? Why wouldn't they have something to do with ethically, an ethical choice? You know, they use that dilemma, I can't remember what it's called, where they make you pull a trigger, right? You can pull the trigger, you press the button, and the train goes off the tracks and kills one person, but you have to intentionally press the button, or don't do anything and it kills all. Which one is a better move, right? I use better or a good move. It's a moral move. Now, there's an ethical conclusion there, but even the pressing of the button becomes a moral dilemma as you're actively involved in actions and cause and effect of what might take place. And so I think the reason our vocabulary reflects things like, hey, that's a good route, or that's a better plan, right? You might actually say that has some outcome that is better and in a sense is morally better. Unless you want to restrict morals to like only behaviors or something to this effect. I mean, I don't know. Maybe the definitions need to be spelled out better.
Or there's no good reason to do that, or she's in good health. All of these are non-moral uses of the word good. And Dr. Harris's contrast of the good life and the bad life is not an ethical contrast between a morally good life and an evil life. It's a contrast between a pleasurable life and a miserable life.
I feel like there's semantic games going on here. Someone who is in the chat, inform me. I'm really curious.
And there's no reason to identify pleasure, misery with good and evil, especially on atheism. So there's just no reason that's been given on atheism for thinking the flourishing of conscious creatures is objectively good. But Dr. Harris has to defend an even more radical claim than that. He claims that the property of being good is identical with the property of creaturely flourishing. And he's not offered any defense of this radical identity claim. In fact, I think we have a knockdown argument against it. Now, bear with me here. This is a little technical. On the next to last page of his book, Dr. Harris makes the telling admission that if people like rapists, liars, and thieves could be just as happy as good people, then his moral landscape would no longer be a moral landscape. Rather, it would just be a continuum of well-being whose peaks are occupied by good and bad people or evil people alike. Now, what's interesting about this is that earlier in the book, Dr. Harris explained that about 3 million Americans are psychopathic. That is to say, they don't care about the mental states of others. They enjoy inflicting pain on other people. But that implies that there's a possible world which we can conceive in which the continuum of human well-being is not a moral landscape. The peaks of well-being could be occupied by evil people. But that entails that in the actual world, the continuum of well-being and the moral landscape are not identical either. For identity is a necessary relation. There is no possible world in which some entity A is not identical to A. So if there's any possible world in which A is not identical to B, then it follows that A is not in fact identical to B. Now, since it's possible that human well-being and moral goodness are not identical, it follows necessarily that human well-being and goodness are not the same as Dr. Harris has asserted in it.
Okay, so that was above my head, all of that. Someone help explain to me in the chat exactly what he's trying to address here. It sounds to me, I understood a little bit before, it sounds to me that William Lane Craig is suggesting that, based on Sam's book, and I haven't read it, is that 3 million Americans are sociopaths, or they psychopathic. They don't care what happens to others. They could, abuse other human beings in various forms, and it doesn't really make their well-being in life, the flourishing diminish. Therefore, under Sam's worldview, the flourishing, the goodness that they experience would be a moral. It wouldn't cause any ethical issue, right? So Sam's world doesn't account for the behavior of sociopaths or psychopaths as if what they're doing is wrong, because they're still flourishing and we want the best flourishing. But in that worldview that's being painted by Craig, he's not accounting for, I imagine what Sam would do is say, but the other individual is also being harmed. So you have to factor in a broader picture. Even if the psychopath can still live a flourishing life after behaving in a immoral manner, the other people who are harmed in the process, that is what we would also measure the overall compass of what is right and what's wrong in that respect. So it should be equally, universally, our brothers and sisters, that everyone feels that they're flourishing in order for the greater good to be taking place. So this is what I'm thinking in my head. Help me out. Let me know in the comments.
His book. Now, it's not often in philosophy that you get a knockdown argument against a position, but I think we've got one here by granting that it's possible that the continuum of well-being is not identical to the moral landscape. Dr. Harris's view becomes logically incoherent. And all of this goes to underline my fundamental point that on atheism, there's just no reason to identify the well-being of conscious creatures with moral goodness. Atheism cannot explain the reality, the objective reality of moral values. What about objective moral duties? I first argued from the is-ought distinction that there is no basis on atheism for thinking that we have any moral duties. And here Dr. Harris says, if we have a moral duty to do anything, we have a duty to avoid the worst possible misery. But the question is the antecedent of that conditional. If we have a moral duty to do anything, what I'm arguing is that on atheism, I don't see any reason to think we have any moral duties to do anything.
It's really, really weird, because I think that Craig's God is fictitious and all in his mind. And if God is fictitious, which I think it is, then you have to figure out why any morality even exists and how to explain it. And it's just odd to me. I don't know. I mean, he's coming from this like objective worldview and this objective moral expectation. I just don't see, how he could prove that it does ground in God. Like, this would be an assumption to me. I say it does, and I say God is the ethical lawgiver, or, goodness just exists apart from God or whatever. At the end of the day, prove that. You have not shown it. You have not proven that. Like, you're making assumptions too while you're sitting here making assumptions of Sam's view. I don't know.
Moral obligations or prohibitions arise in response to imperatives from a competent authority. For example, if a policeman tells you to pull over, then because of his authority, who he is, you are legally obligated to pull over. But if some random stranger tells you to pull over, you're not legally obligated to do so. Now, in the absence of God, what authority is there to issue moral commands or prohibitions?
This is the point I was getting at. He needs a fictitious master. He needs a fictitious lawgiver in order to make sense of any kind of is-ought. What you should do, what you ought to do, And, you know, humans have constructed laws. You could say that they've constructed them in a fictitious standard up here, that they are laws that we all abide by, but they're based on observations and experience in the way we've developed as societies. I don't understand why you need a top-down explanation for this. Help me in the audience. Help me.
There is none on atheism, and therefore there are no moral imperatives for us to obey. In the absence of God, there just isn't any sort of moral obligation or prohibition that characterizes our lives. In particular, we're not morally obligated to promote the flourishing of conscious creatures. So
if human society decides to create laws that we are supposed to, let's just say they finally outlaw the mass killing of animals, let's just say, as far as like farm, production goes. Would you say that divine commandment had to come from God? Because where are you reading this from? Where is that commandment? Show me where your God has given that law, right? He's basing it on the Bible, ladies and gentlemen. It's all rooted in the Bible.
His ought distinction seems to me to be one that's fatal to Dr. Harris's position and has been widely recognized as such by reviewers of the moral landscape. But secondly, the problem that's even worse is the ought implies can problem. In the absence of the ability to do otherwise, there is no moral responsibility. In the absence of freedom of the will, we are just puppets or electrochemical machines. And puppets do not have moral responsibilities. Machines are not moral obligations. But on Dr. Harris's view, there is no freedom of the will, either in a libertarian or a compatibilistic sense, and therefore there is no moral responsibility. So there isn't even the possibility of moral duty on his view. So while I can affirm and applaud Dr. Harris's affirmation of the objectivity of moral values and moral duties, at the end of the day, his philosophical worldview just doesn't ground these entities that we both want to affirm. If God exists, then we clearly have a sound foundation for objective moral values and moral duties. But if God does not exist, that is, if atheism is true, then there is no basis for the affirmation of objective moral values, and there is no ground for objective moral duties, because there is no moral lawgiver and there is no freedom of the will. And therefore, it seems to me that atheism is simply bereft of the adequate ontological foundations to establish the moral life.
Oh my God, there's so much there. He gets into free will, which is a whole nother rabbit trail of how Sam's going to unravel this, but also just the way that he laid out this whole issue at the end here about, it sounds like he wants every single rule and law to be dictated from God in order for that to be good or bad. And Sam is saying, we have an idea of what a healthy person is, but do we know how fast they run? No, we don't. And not all of them run the same speed. And so there's a lot of complexity involved in Sam's worldview and a lot of simplicity. I need a daddy to tell me when I can and cannot do stuff on William Lane Craig's view, it seems, which I like what Sam's doing because it leaves open the possibility of learning further and not a revelatory system. Once you have a revelatory system that says what's right, what's wrong, then you got a problem. Same-sex relationships. We know that the Christian worldview typically damns this often, especially the evangelical ones. So why would you do that if you're actually looking at the flourishing and the way our societies are starting to recognize they're not harming anybody? In fact, they love just like we love, and it's insanity to think otherwise.
Dr. Harris now has 12 minutes. Timekeeper, are you ready? Begin.
Well, that was all very interesting. Ask yourselves, what is wrong with spending eternity in hell? Well, I'm told it's rather hot there, for one. Dr. Craig is not offering an alternative view of morality. Okay, the whole point of Christianity, or so it is imagined, is to safeguard the eternal well-being of human souls. Now, happily, there's absolutely no evidence the Christian hell exists. And I think we should look at the consequences of believing in this framework, this theistic framework, in this world, and what these moral underpinnings actually would be. All right. 9 million children die every year before they reach the age of 5. Okay, picture an Asian tsunami of the sort we saw in 2004 that killed 250,000 people. One of those every 10 days, killing children only under 5. Okay, it's 24,000 children a day, 1,000 an hour, 17 or so a minute. That means before I can get to the end of this sentence, some few children, very likely, will have died in terror and agony. Think of the parents of these children. Think of the fact that most of these men and women believe in God and are praying at this moment for their children to be spared. And their prayers will not be answered.
I love the calm demeanor that Sam brings, sobering thought, but also he's going to the jugular of Christianity. Hell is nonsense. It's fictitious. We have no reason to think it exists. He's playing an interesting game here. I can't wait to see what unravels in this rebuttal.
Okay, but according to Dr. Craig, this is all part of God's plan. Any God who would allow children by the millions to suffer and die in this way, and their parents to grieve in this way, either can do nothing to help them or doesn't care to. He is therefore either impotent or evil. And worse than that, on Dr. Craig's view, most of these people, many of these people certainly, will be going to hell because they're praying to the wrong God. Just think about that. Okay, through no fault of their own, they were born into the wrong culture where they got the wrong theology and they missed the revelation.
I've actually heard William Lane Craig elsewhere argue that God knew beforehand that they wouldn't have accepted the gospel, so he practically lets them be born in areas where they may never hear it, and therefore they would have not accepted it anyways. And I thought to myself, what? I was a Calvinist thinking, that's a wild, philosophical gymnastics move to get out of this problem.
Okay, there are 1.2 billion people in India at this moment. Most of them are Hindus, most of them therefore polytheists. Okay, in Dr. Craig's universe, no matter how good these people are, they are doomed. If you are praying to the monkey god Hanuman, you are doomed. Okay. You will be tortured in hell for eternity. Now, is there the slightest evidence for this? No. It just says so in Mark 9 and Matthew 13 and Revelation 14. Okay, perhaps you'll remember from the Lord of the Rings, it says when the elves die, they go to Valinor, but they can be reborn in Middle-earth. I say that just as a point of comparison.
He's comparing Lord of the Rings to the Bible and its claims. Oh, man.
Okay, so God created the cultural isolation of the Hindus. Okay, he engineered the circumstance of their deaths in ignorance of revelation, and then he created the penalty for this ignorance, which is an eternity of conscious torment in fire. Okay, on the other hand, on Dr. Craig's account, your run-of-the-mill serial killer in America, okay, who spent his life raping and torturing children, need only come to God, come to Jesus on death row, and after a final meal of fried chicken, he's going to spend an eternity in heaven after death. Okay, one thing should be crystal clear to you. This vision of life has absolutely nothing to do with moral accountability. Okay, and please notice the double standard that people like Dr. Craig use to exonerate God from all this evil. Okay, we're told that God is loving and kind and just and intrinsically good, But when someone like myself points out the rather obvious and compelling evidence that God is cruel and unjust because he visits suffering on innocent people of a scope and scale that would embarrass the most ambitious psychopath, okay, we're told that God is mysterious. Okay, who can understand God's will? Okay, and yet this is precisely, this merely human understanding of God's will is precisely what believers use to establish his goodness in the first place. You know, something good happens to a Christian. He feels some bliss while praying, say, or he sees some positive change in his life, and we're told that God is good. Okay, but when children by the tens of thousands are torn from their parents' arms and drowned, we're told that God is mysterious.
Or even that God is good still, but he's working in mysterious ways and he has every reason to do what he's doing. That's the kind of justification that we hear from Christians all the time. And it's like, dude, really?
This is how you play tennis.
And the final card they do is say, look, he killed his own son so that you could, be free. And he judged his own son. At least he's consistent. And it's like, he killed his own son. Wow. That's morally a good thing.
Without the net.
Tennis without the net.
And I want to suggest to you that it is not only tiresome when otherwise intelligent people speak this way, it is morally reprehensible. This kind of faith is the perfection of narcissism. God loves me. Don't you know? He cured me of my eczema. He makes me feel so good while singing in church. And just when we had given up hope, he found a banker who was willing to reduce my mother's mortgage. Okay, given all that this God of yours does not accomplish in the lives of others, given the misery that's being imposed on some helpless child at this instant, this kind of faith is obscene. Okay, to think in this way is to fail to reason honestly or to care sufficiently about the suffering of other human beings.
Wow.
And if God is good and loving and just and kind, and he wanted to guide us morally with a book, why give us a book that supports slavery? Why give us a book that admonishes us to kill people for imaginary crimes like witchcraft? Now, of course, there's a way of not taking these questions to heart. Okay, according to Dr. Craig's divine command theory, God is not bound by moral duties. God doesn't have to be good. Whatever he commands is good. So when he commands that the Israelites to slaughter the Amalekites, that behavior becomes intrinsically good because he commanded it. Okay, well, here we're being offered, I'm glad he raised the issue of psychopathy, we're being offered a psychopathic and psychotic moral attitude. It's psychotic because this is completely delusional. There's no reason to believe that we live in a universe ruled by an invisible monster, Yahweh.
Damn. Sam is absolutely right here.
But it is psychopathic because this is a total detachment from the well-being of human beings. This so easily rationalizes the slaughter of children. Okay, just think about the Muslims at this moment who are blowing themselves up, okay, convinced that they are agents of God's will. There's absolutely nothing that Dr. Craig can say against their behavior in moral terms, apart from his own faith-based claim that they're praying to the wrong God. Okay, if they had the right God, what they were doing would be good on divine command theory.
Oh, just work Craig's view against himself. That's the point. Who's to say your God's right? What if the Muslim's God is true, Craig? Now what? If the Muslim God is the real God, how are you going to respond to this? How will you address this issue? That, wouldn't you take it, that these guys are following him to the most nth degree and willing to lay their own lives down in order to do Allah's will?
Now, I'm obviously not saying that Dr. Craig or all religious people are psychopaths and psychotics, but this to me is the true horror of religion. Okay, it allows perfectly decent and sane people to believe by the billions what only lunatics could believe on their own. Okay, if you wake up tomorrow morning thinking that saying a few Latin words over your pancakes is going to turn them into the body of Elvis Presley, okay, you have lost your mind.
Sam is good.
Okay, but if you think more or less the same thing about a cracker and the body of Jesus, you're just a Catholic.
Dude, that is so good, man. He is on point.
And I'm not the first person to notice that it's a very strange sort of loving God who would make salvation depend on believing in him on bad evidence. Okay, I mean, if you lived 2,000 years ago, there was evidence galore. I mean, he was just performing miracles, but apparently he got tired of being so helpful. Okay, and so now we all inherit this very heavy burden of the doctrine's implausibility, and the effort to square it with what we now know about the cosmos and what we know about the all too human origins of Scripture becomes more and more difficult.
Yeah, because where is Craig getting his philosophical grounding of God being for morality, if it isn't from the fact that he believes in revelation, he believes in the biblical God? Like, we know this is how he's grounding all these things.
And it's not just the generic God that Dr. Craig is recommending. It is God the Father and Jesus the Son. Okay, Christianity, on Dr. Craig's account, is the true moral wealth of the world. Well, I hate to break it to you here at Notre Dame, but Christianity is a cult of human sacrifice. Christianity is not a religion that repudiates human sacrifice. It is a religion that celebrates a single human sacrifice as though it were effective.
It's a death cult. Take up your cross, follow me, let's leave this earth. My kingdom is not of this world kind of mentality. Dying is to live, living is to die.
God so loved the world that he gave his only son, John 3:16. Okay, the idea is that Jesus suffered the crucifixion so that none need suffer hell, except that those billions in India and billions like them throughout history. Okay, this is astride. This doctrine is astride a contemptible history of scientific ignorance and religious barbarism. We come from people who used to bury children under the foundations of new buildings as offerings to their imaginary gods. I mean, just think about that. There, in vast numbers of societies, people would bury children in post holes, people like ourselves thinking that this would prevent an invisible being from knocking down their buildings. Okay. These are the sorts of people who wrote the Bible. Okay, if there is a less moral framework than the one Dr. Craig is proposing, I haven't heard of it.
Dang, look, even Craig's face is kind of like, jeez. Look, Sam took his gloves off. He went bare knuckle fighting with Craig just now. Sam took it to a whole nother level. And after this will be Q&A, I imagine, or they get to engage back and forth directly. That'll be the next video, ladies and gentlemen, and Q&A as well. I'm really interested in hearing it now that I hear Sam is taking the gloves off. It's really addressing the foundation of William Lane Craig's worldview. So be sure to subscribe, check the bell. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who is part of this community. You really have just made me have so much energy. I wake up in the morning, I look forward to these reactions. Thank you for the suggestions of reacting to certain videos. It means the world to me. Be sure to like this one before you leave. Share it to your socials if you can, but I'm really interested in hearing some of the comments from you smart people in the audience who understand this philosophy stuff a lot better than I do, to tell me what you saw and kind of the BS that you heard. from either proponent. I'd like to hear. I really appreciate you, and until next time, see you then.